The Battle of Issus was the confrontation that showed the world that Alexander the Great was not simply a lucky Macedonian adventurer, but a military genius capable of defeating the most powerful empire on earth. In the narrow coastal plains of Cilicia, between the Taurus Mountains and the Mediterranean Sea, a young man of 23 years old changed the course of world history forever. It was the day when Persian power, invincible for 2 centuries, began its definitive collapse. This battle represented much more than a clash between 2 armies. It was the confrontation between 2 worlds, East and West, despotism and Greek freedom, ancient tradition against military innovation. The result not only decided the fate of Asia Minor, but opened the doors of the entire Persian Empire to Macedonian conquest. After Issus, it would no longer be possible to stop Alexander. The road to Babylon, Persepolis, and India lay open. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Issus, one must place oneself in the context of an expedition that had begun 2 years earlier with apparently limited objectives. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 before Christ, many believed he would be content with liberating the Greek cities of Asia Minor and perhaps conquering the western coast of Anatolia. Few imagined that the young king had in mind nothing less than the conquest of the entire known world. Alexander's first great victory at the river Granicus had been impressive, but it could also be explained as a tactical victory against a poorly prepared regional army. The Persian satraps had underestimated the Macedonians.
The cavalry must hold the line,
they had made
advance.
wrong tactical decisions. They had allowed the element of surprise to work against them. It was understandable that Darius III, the great king, did not feel excessively concerned about the loss of a border battle. But when the news reached Persepolis that Alexander had conquered the entire western coast of Asia Minor, that the Greek cities were rebelling against Persian rule, that the Greek mercenaries were changing sides en masse, Darius understood that he faced an existential threat. It was not a plundering raid that could be resolved with diplomacy or bribes. It was a full-scale invasion that threatened the very foundations of the Persian Empire. Darius's response was to assemble an army the likes of which had not been seen in generations. From the most remote satrapies came contingents, heavy cavalry from Bactria, mounted archers from Scythia, disciplined infantry from Media, slingers from the Caucasian mountains. The core of the army was formed by the Immortals, the Persian elite guard that had been the nightmare of the Greeks during the Median Wars. Greek hoplite mercenaries were also added, experienced men who knew Macedonian tactics and could counter them. The exact numbers are still debated by historians, but it is likely that Darius gathered between 100,000 and 150,000 men. It was a host that represented the ethnic diversity of the largest empire in the world: Persians, Magius, Assyrians, Bactrians, Scythians, Armenians, Cappadocians. Each contingent brought its own military traditions, its characteristic weapons, its tactics perfected over centuries of war. Alexander, meanwhile, had established his base of operations in the coastal city of Issus, a strategic port that gave him access to the sea and allowed him to maintain his supply lines with Macedonia. His army was much smaller, probably no more than 35,000 men, but it was a homogeneous force forged in years of continuous campaigning. The core of the Macedonian army remained the phalanx, that formation of spearmen with 6-meter pikes that had revolutionized Greek warfare. But Alexander had perfected the system inherited from his father Philip, adding tactical flexibility and coordination between different types of troops. The Hypaspes served as elite infantry, more mobile than the phalanx, but equally lethal. The Cretan archers provided long-range firepower. The companion cavalry, led personally by Alexander, was the hammer that broke the enemy lines after the phalanx had fixed them in position. Darius's decision to march personally at the head of his army sent a clear message. This was not just another campaign against local rebels, but a war for the survival of the Persian Empire. The great king, who normally directed his wars from the comfort of his palaces, had decided to stake his personal prestige on the outcome of this battle. Darius's initial strategy was logical. He knew the geography of Asia Minor better than Alexander. He had informants in every city. He could choose the most favorable battlefield for his forces. His plan was to use a mountain pass to appear behind Alexander, cutting the Macedonian lines of communication with the sea and forcing the young king to fight under unfavorable conditions. Alexander had departed from Issus, heading south towards Syria, with the intention of continuing his conquest of the Mediterranean coast. It was a strategy that made sense. Controlling the ports meant depriving the Persian fleet of operational bases, securing communications with Greece, maintaining the flow of supplies and reinforcements, but it also meant moving away from the mountains that could have provided advantageous defensive positions. Darius executed his maneuver with precision, using mountain passes unknown to the Macedonians. He managed to position his enormous army north of Alexander, between the invaders and their base at Issus. It was a brilliant strategic maneuver that should have trapped Alexander in an impossible position. The young king found himself cut off from his supply lines with an enormously superior army blocking his retreat. But Alexander was not an ordinary commander. When his scouts brought him news of the Persian army's presence to the north, he showed no signs of panic or discouragement. On the contrary, he seemed pleased that Darius had finally decided to confront him in person. It was the opportunity he had been waiting for, the possibility of ending the war with a single blow by defeating the great king himself. Alexander's response was typical of his tactical genius. Instead of trying to escape or seeking a defensive position, he immediately ordered the army to turn and march north to face the Persians. It was a bold decision that turned the apparent strategic disadvantage into a tactical opportunity. If he could defeat Darius, he would not only win a battle, but destroy the center of power of the Persian Empire. The terrain where the battle would take place paradoxically favored the Macedonians despite their numerical inferiority. The coastal plains between the Taurus Mountains and the sea were narrow enough that Darius could not fully deploy his enormous army. His numerical advantage was neutralized by geography, while the superior quality and cohesion of the Macedonian troops was magnified in a restricted space. The two armies met on a plain that was barely 3 kilometers wide, crossed by a small river called the Pinarus. It was exactly the type of terrain that Alexander would have chosen if he had been able to design the battlefield personally. The mountains prevented the Persians from enveloping him on the flanks. The sea protected one of his sides, and the narrow front meant that only a fraction of the Persian army could participate effectively in the combat. Darius, realizing too late that he had made a strategic mistake, tried to compensate with an intelligent tactical deployment. He placed his best troops, the Immortals and the Greek mercenaries, in the center where he expected the main attack of the Macedonian phalanx. His heavy cavalry was deployed on the right flank, where it had more room to maneuver. The archers and slingers were distributed along the entire line to maximize their firepower. Alexander responded with the classic deployment he had perfected over years of campaigning. The phalanx formed in the center a wall of pikes pointing forward like a giant porcupine. The hypaspes were placed on the right flank of the phalanx, providing tactical flexibility. At the extreme right, Alexander took personal position at the head of the companion cavalry, the elite unit that constituted his decisive weapon. The morning of the confrontation dawned clear, with a sea breeze carrying the scent of salt toward the mountains. Ritual sacrifices were performed on both sides. The diviners promised victory to both armies as was customary, but the veteran soldiers knew that this time the stakes were total. The loser would not only see his army destroyed, but his entire civilization. The battle began with an exchange of projectiles that lasted almost an hour. The Persian archers, superior in number, launched clouds of arrows against the Macedonian lines. Alexander's soldiers protected themselves behind their shields, waiting for the right moment to attack. Some fell under the rain of projectiles, but Macedonian discipline held firm. Alexander had learned the lesson from previous battles. He knew that trying to advance frontally against an enemy superior in number and well-positioned was a recipe for disaster. Instead, he developed a tactic that took advantage of both the geography and the characteristics of his army. He would order a coordinated attack that combined the frontal pressure of the phalanx with a devastating cavalry charge on the right flank. The signal for the attack came when Alexander considered that the Persian archers had exhausted most of their arrows. His war cry echoed across the entire Macedonian line, and 35,000 voices responded in unison. It was a sound that froze the blood, the roar of predators that had smelled blood and were preparing for the slaughter. The phalanx advanced with the mechanical precision that had made the Macedonians famous. 18,000 men marching at the same rhythm, their pikes pointing forward like an unstoppable war machine. The ground trembled under their feet, the air filled with the noise of metal against metal. The war cries of both sides created a cacophony that could be heard for kilometers. Meanwhile, Alexander personally led the cavalry charge on the right flank. It was a breathtaking sight. The young king with his armor shining in the sun, his helmet decorated with white plumes that made him visible across the entire battlefield, his spear pointing directly toward where he knew Darius was located. The initial clash was tremendous. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia received the phalanx with the same discipline they had learned in their native cities. They knew Macedonian tactics. They knew how to respond to the pike charge. They had developed specific counter-maneuvers over years of service in Oriental armies. For a moment, the outcome was uncertain. The Greek mercenaries proved they were still formidable soldiers. Their round shields deflected the Macedonian pikes. Their spears sought gaps in the enemy armor. Their discipline matched that of the phalanx. It was a confrontation between two Greek military systems, a civil war within the war between civilizations. But Alexander had calculated that the real blow would come from the flank. His cavalry, after breaking the Persian lines at the extreme right, turned toward the center and attacked the mercenaries fighting the phalanx from the side. It was the same tactic he would use again and again throughout his career. Fix the enemy with the infantry and then break their lines with a perfectly coordinated cavalry charge. The Greek mercenaries attacked from two sides, and without the possibility of receiving reinforcements, began to give ground. It was not an immediate defeat, but a gradual collapse that accelerated when they realized they were being enveloped. Some tried to retreat in order, others surrendered. The majority simply fled toward the rear. The decisive moment came when Alexander, after breaking the lines of mercenaries, directed his cavalry directly toward the center of the Persian army, where he knew Darius was located. It was a suicidal charge under normal conditions, but the circumstances were no longer normal. The Persian line had weakened. Confusion spread through its ranks. Commanders were losing control of their units. Darius, seeing Alexander approaching with his cavalry, found himself in a situation that no great king had faced in centuries. He was about to be captured or killed in personal combat with an enemy he had completely underestimated. It was a moment that would define not only the battle, but the fate of the entire Persian Empire. Darius's decision to flee the battlefield has been criticized by historians for more than 2 millennia, but it was probably the only rational option. His capture or death would have meant the immediate collapse of all Persian resistance. By escaping, he kept alive the possibility of regrouping his forces, assembling another army, continuing the war from the eastern satrapies. But the psychological effect of the great king's flight was devastating for Persian morale. When the soldiers saw that their supreme leader was abandoning the battlefield, all military discipline disintegrated. It was not an organized retreat, but a desperate stampede in which every man sought to save his own life. The pursuit that followed became a massacre. The Macedonian cavalry, led by Alexander personally, overtook thousands of fleeing Persians. There was no quarter for those who had threatened the very existence of Macedonia. It was both revenge and strategy. Every dead Persian was one less enemy who could regroup for future battles. The Persian losses were enormous. Ancient historians speak of tens of thousands dead. Although these figures are probably exaggerated, what is clear is that the Persian army as an organized military force ceased to exist. The elite units were destroyed. The experienced commanders died or fled. The command system disintegrated completely. For the Macedonians, the losses were minimal. Alexander had achieved the perfect victory, destroying an enemy army superior in number without sacrificing his own troops. It was a demonstration of tactical genius that impressed even his enemies. The Persians who survived the battle carried stories of Macedonian invincibility that spread throughout the empire. But the true importance of Issus was not in the military casualties, but in its political consequences. Alexander had captured not only the Persian camp with its immense riches, but also Darius's family, his mother, his wife, his daughters. It was a prize that had both practical and symbolic value. Practically, it gave him bargaining chips for future diplomacy. Symbolically, it demonstrated that Persian power could no longer protect even its own loved ones. The news of the Issus victory spread like wildfire throughout the Mediterranean world. In Greece, the cities that had remained neutral or had timidly supported Persia hastened to send embassies to Alexander. In Egypt, the priests began to plan his reception as a liberator. In the eastern satrapies of the Persian Empire, local governors began to consider whether it was worth remaining loyal to a great king who had fled from battle. For Darius, Issus represented the beginning of the end. Although he would manage to assemble another army years later at Gaugamela, he would never recover the prestige lost in the plains of Cilicia. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Persian Empire for 2 centuries had vanished forever. The subjected peoples began to consider rebellion. The satraps began to act independently. The imperial system gradually fragmented. Alexander, on the contrary, found himself transformed from a lucky adventurer into a conqueror of the world. Issus had shown him that he could defeat not only regional armies, but the central power of the largest empire on earth. If he could defeat Darius in person, what enemy could stop him? The road to Babylon, Persepolis, Susa, India lay open. The battle also marked a change in Alexander's strategy. Before Issus, he had shown some willingness to negotiate, to seek diplomatic solutions, to be content with partial conquests. After Issus, when Darius offered him peace terms that included enormous territories and a marriage alliance, Alexander rejected them outright. He no longer wanted part of the Persian Empire. He wanted it all. The consequences of Issus extended far beyond the military world. The Macedonian victory opened the East to Greek influence in a way that changed forever the culture, art, philosophy, and science of all Asia. The Hellenism that emerged from Alexander's conquest transformed civilizations from Egypt to India, creating a cultural synthesis that would endure for centuries. For the soldiers who fought at Issus, both Macedonians and Persians, the battle became the defining experience of their lives. The Macedonian veterans would remember it as the day they realized they were participating in something greater than a simple military campaign. They were changing the world. The Persian survivors would remember it as the day when their millennial world began to crumble. In the coastal plains where the battle was fought, where the fate of 2 continents was decided, the bones of the fallen warriors mixed with the Cilician soil. They had participated in one of the most decisive moments in human history. The day when East and West collided and a new world order emerged. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. It had opened the doors to an era of cultural, scientific, and commercial exchange that would enrich all humanity. This has demonstrated that individual genius could overcome any material advantage, that tactical innovation could defeat millennial tradition, that a young visionary could change the course of history. It was the lesson that Alexander would carry with him to India, the conviction that there were no limits to what a determined man could achieve.